Have you ever considered that nothing is wrong with your life at all? That the delay you feel is not a blockage, but precision? You are not stuck. You are stabilized. You are living inside a reality that perfectly matches the version of yourself you have been practicing in silence. Every repeated reaction, every familiar doubt, every emotional pattern you rehearse without noticing. Reality is not punishing you, it is agreeing with you. What feels like slow progress is not evidence that manifestation failed. It is evidence that it is functioning with exact accuracy. The field does not miscalculate. It organizes around consistency. And consistency is identity made stable. Here is the part most people avoid. You do not move into a new timeline because you want something intensely. Wanting is surface level. Timelines shift when who you are can no longer coexist with where you stand. Until that internal mismatch happens, there is nothing for reality to rearrange. Many imagine quantum jumping as a dramatic relocation, a cosmic doorway, a sudden lift into a better life. But the mechanics are quieter than that. Consciousness selects from possibility. Experience crystallizes around the identity that dominates your awareness. Time is not a hallway you walk through step by step. From a quantum perspective, multiple versions of your life already exist as valid probabilities. Calmer versions, wealthier versions, more fulfilled versions. They are not fantasies. They are configurations waiting for coherence. And coherence is not effort. It is alignment sustained. You do not shift because you visualized once. You shift because you became internally incompatible with your former self. The real question is not whether a better version of your life exists. It is whether your nervous system feels safe embodying it. This is where most people unconsciously resist their own expansion. They ask for abundance while emotionally stabilizing scarcity. They ask for love while remaining loyal to fear. They ask for freedom while identifying with limitation. The field does not respond to what you request occasionally. It responds to what you consistently are. There is another layer beneath this. The nervous system is designed to prefer familiarity over possibility. Predictability feels safe, even if it is unsatisfying. The unknown, even when beneficial, can feel threatening. So when change begins to approach, the body tightens. Not because the change is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. Repetition is not failure. It is practiced identity. You have become exceptionally skilled at being who you have always been. And reality mirrors that skill with loyalty. If that feels confronting, it should. Because hidden inside this truth is freedom. You are not waiting for a miracle to rescue you. You are maintaining a pattern that can be interrupted. Quantum shifting is not escape. It is the gentle destabilization of an outdated self. Not through force, but through outgrowing. The leap is not an event in time. It is a redefinition of self-perception. Consider this honestly. If your life transformed overnight, would your body relax into it? Or would it immediately search for problems to fix and doubts to confirm? Your answer reveals the version of reality you are currently anchored to. The future you desire already exists as potential, but potential condenses where stability lives. You are not unlucky. You are not blocked. You are coherent with the identity you have rehearsed. And that is powerful news. Because if coherence generates experience, then shifting timelines is not about pushing harder. It is about becoming emotionally incompatible with the old narrative of yourself. When that incompatibility reaches a certain intensity, reality reorganizes with surprising speed. The shift does not begin outside. It begins the moment you can no longer emotionally sustain who you used to be. Quantum physics does not describe a rigid universe of fixed objects. It describes a landscape of possibilities. Before observation, outcomes exist as multiple states simultaneously. Only when observed does one become measurable. Some physicists, including Amit Goswami, suggest that consciousness itself is the fundamental observer. Experience becomes tangible through conscious selection. This implies something profound. Your life is not randomly assigned. It is selected through dominant identification. And here is the subtle truth most overlook. Reality does not collapse according to fleeting thoughts. It stabilizes around the identity you most consistently embody. So the real question is no longer how do I get there? It is who is choosing from possibility right now. You can tell yourself you are ready for a new reality. You can say the words with conviction, but if the deeper layer of you still defines itself through struggle, doubt, or inadequacy, that layer is the one selecting your experience. Desire speaks loudly, identity speaks constantly, and what is constant always outweighs what is loud. This is why forcing change feels draining. You are trying to paint over a structure that has not been rebuilt. The surface intention may be ambitious, but the foundation underneath remains unchanged, and foundations decide what can stand. Parallel reality manifestation is not an act of willpower. It is the quiet fading of an outdated self-concept. When an old identity loses emotional authority, another probability gains stability. No drama, no spectacle, just a shift in what feels natural. Consider identity as a climate rather than a single thought. Every possible version of your life exists within reach, but you do not access them through statements. You access them through sustained internal conditions. Your nervous system calibrates what feels normal, and normal determines what solidifies. If your inner baseline is tension, vigilance, or self-doubt, you will continue confirming circumstances that mirror those states. If your baseline becomes regulated, secure, and open, different outcomes begin to crystallize, not because you demanded them, but because you became compatible with them. Neuroscience supports this more than most realize. Repeated emotional states strengthen neural pathways. Strengthened pathways shape perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior reinforces results. Results then confirm identity. The cycle sustains itself quietly. So when someone says they feel trapped in a timeline, what they are truly describing is conditioning. A nervous system trained to reproduce familiar reactions, even when those reactions limit possibility. Here is the liberating truth. If consciousness selects experience, then altering the observer alters what becomes tangible, not through fantasy, but through embodiment. When your self-perception changes at an emotional level, not just intellectually, the probability you have been reinforcing begins to weaken. Sometimes the external shift appears sudden. Others call it luck. But internally, coherence had been reorganizing for months, maybe years. There comes a stage when the old identity starts to feel restrictive. The reactions that once felt automatic begin to feel heavy. The familiar responses lose their comfort. That sensation is not regression, it is structural instability, and instability is necessary. Most people retreat at this point. They rush back to the predictable version of themselves because uncertainty feels unsafe. But if you remain present during that internal unraveling, without clinging to who you used to be, something subtle transforms. The vantage point changes, and when perception changes, outcomes follow. You do not enter a new timeline by intensifying effort. You enter by discontinuing reinforcement of the previous one. The field reorganizes around what becomes internally consistent. The real practice is not chasing a future scenario. It is allowing your current identity to dissolve without panic. This dissolution is often quiet. There are no fireworks, just small moments where you respond differently than before. The most challenging part of shifting realities is not accessing new potential. It is interrupting the unconscious confirmation of the old pattern. Look carefully at your daily internal responses, not the dramatic crises, the subtle ones, the quick tension when plans shift, the silent comparison when someone succeeds, the reflex to anticipate disappointment before receiving news. These micro responses accumulate. They are not trivial. They are confirmations. Every predictable reaction strengthens a specific self-concept, and every reinforced self-concept narrows the range of probabilities that feel safe. This explains why some people feel close to change for years. They study manifestation, they visualize, they feel inspired temporarily, but their emotional baseline remains intact. And baseline is what stabilizes reality, not occasional motivation. As Joe Dispenza teaches, personality creates personal reality. Personality is not just behavior, it is memorized emotion. If your personality has been conditioned by stress, control, or disappointment, those emotional signatures become the dominant pattern you project. The field reflects patterns, not preferences. You do not experience what you occasionally wish for. You experience what you repeatedly embody. There is also an unexpected attachment to the familiar self. Even when it causes suffering, it feels known. And what is known feels safe. So when opportunity approaches, the body often contracts before the mind understands why. Instead of softening into expansion, you brace. That brief contraction is enough to re-stabilize the previous pattern. This is not punishment, it is coherence in action. Potential remains open until stabilized by observation. But stabilization requires steadiness. If you briefly embody growth and then return to contraction, instability persists. And instability cannot sustain a new outcome. Consistency of being is what transforms probability into lived experience. If two internal states exist within you at the same time, the one you have practiced the longest will prevail. Not the one you declare, not the one you post about, the one you return to when no one is watching. This is why profound shifts feel uncommon, because sustained identity change is uncommon. Most people attempt to reach forward while still gripping who they have been. They try to install a new future without uninstalling the old self. But transformation is not an addition, it is a removal. You remove the emotional reflexes that anchored you. You remove the assumptions that kept repeating. You remove the loyalty to familiar pain, and removal rarely feels exciting. It feels like loss. Growth often carries the texture of grief, not because something outside of you disappeared, but because a former version of you no longer fits. When you stop responding the way you always did, there is a moment of disorientation. When you stop anticipating disappointment, there is a sense of exposure. When you stop managing every possible outcome, there is vulnerability. That vulnerability is not weakness, it is transition. A timeline does not shift because you intensified effort. It shifts when the previous identity loses its ability to sustain itself. There is a threshold where the old reactions begin to feel artificial, where habitual worry feels unnecessary, where shrinking yourself feels unnatural. Many interpret that threshold as confusion. In truth, it is detachment, and detachment loosens probability. When the emotional charge around your old narrative fades, space opens. When your nervous system no longer rehearses lack or defense, the matching reality loses stability. The shift is subtle. You do not erupt into a different life. You simply become less compatible with the former one. That incompatibility builds quietly until change becomes inevitable. The deeper question then arises: how do you cultivate this incompatibility without turning it into another strategy of control? Because forcing evolution is still the old pattern wearing new language. The change must be embodied. There already exists a version of you aligned with the next phase of your life. Not an exaggerated fantasy, a neurologically distinct configuration. That version does not interpret uncertainty as danger. It does not treat delay as rejection. It does not demand constant reassurance before relaxing. It does not mentally simulate failure before allowing expansion. That is the difference. Shifts are not dramatic events. They are identity stabilizations. The external world rearranges when your internal baseline can no longer cooperate with the outdated script. Often the leap feels quiet. You notice you no longer over-explain yourself. You notice you are not scanning for what might go wrong. You notice fear arises, but you do not negotiate with it. Not because you force discipline, but because the old intensity no longer resonates. That is evolution. From a quantum lens, consciousness selects from potential. From a neurological lens, repetition creates dominance. When these two principles synchronize, contradiction dissolves. Most people live in contradiction. They claim to want abundance, yet stabilize vigilance. They desire intimacy, yet embody protection. They ask for freedom, yet operate through control. Opposing signals cannot solidify simultaneously. The most stable pattern determines the outcome. The true leap is coherence between who you are and what you say you desire. And coherence is not generated through excitement. It is generated through normalization. When your desired reality feels ordinary instead of distant, stabilization accelerates. When expansion feels familiar rather than intimidating, probabilities reorganize with less resistance. You do not compel the next timeline. You become steady enough to sustain it. So pause and examine something honestly. If the next phase of your life required emotional regulation, would you qualify? If it required releasing the need to prove yourself, Would you feel unanchored? If it required abandoning your old reactions entirely, would you hesitate? These are not motivational prompts. They are diagnostics. They reveal which identity you are still protecting. The field does not reorganize around how hard you try. It reorganizes around what you consistently are. That is where your power has always been. Not in chasing outcomes, not in pursuing a distant version of life, but in deciding which identity you are stabilizing daily. If something within you recognizes this truth, do not turn it into another concept to analyze. Anchor it, claim it internally, not as a wish for change, but as a decision about who you are becoming. When you declare alignment with your next level, you are not requesting movement. You are signaling readiness to release the patterns that kept you anchored. And that release is subtle but significant. The moment you stop emotionally investing in the old identity, reorganization begins. It does not require force, it requires consistency. Understanding identity is intellectual. Training identity is biological. Shifting timelines is not mystical, it is mechanical. Every reality you have occupied was stabilized through repetition. Repetition of perception, repetition of emotion, repetition of reaction. If you want a different probability to solidify, you do not need a dramatic breakthrough. You need steady rehearsal of a different internal state until it becomes more natural than the previous one. Many misunderstand this and attempt to intensify visualization. They try to amplify desire until belief feels convincing, but intensity is unstable. Stability is what teaches the nervous system that the new identity is safe. Begin with neutrality. Instead of imagining your future with urgency or excitement, imagine it with calm certainty. Allow the image to exist while your body remains relaxed. If you notice tension in your jaw, chest, or stomach, soften it while maintaining the vision. You are teaching your biology that expansion does not equal danger. That is the first interruption. Then observe your subtle reactions throughout the day. When something shifts unexpectedly, does your body brace? Does your mind predict delay? Does irritation rise automatically? Those small reflexes are the previous identity reaffirming itself. Pause deliberately. Lengthen your exhale until it becomes slower than your inhale. This signals safety to the nervous system. In that pause, you interrupt automatic selection. Remember, reality stabilizes through dominant perception. When you interpret events through anxiety, you reinforce anxious outcomes. When you interpret through steadiness, you reinforce a different trajectory. You are not controlling the world, you are selecting from available outcomes. Selection demands consistency. During a genuine shift, something else occurs. Emotional charge begins to detach. The former identity depended on reaction for survival. When reactions decrease, it weakens. And as it weakens, the reality connected to it loses structure. This often creates an in-between phase. The old circumstances feel unstable, yet the new configuration has not fully solidified. This is not regression, it is transition. You are no longer fully identified with who you were, but you are still stabilizing who you are becoming. Do not rush this phase. If you attempt to control outcomes out of fear, you reinforce the past. If you remain regulated and patient, the emerging identity strengthens. Each evening, ask yourself a different question. If I were already established in my desired reality, how would I interpret today? Not what actions would change. How would meaning change? Interpretation shifts the observer. And when the observer shifts, the selected outcome shifts with it. When you begin to reinterpret challenges as neutral information rather than personal failure, you dissolve the emotional glue binding you to the previous narrative. Carry that interpretation forward. This is not denial, it is conscious reselection. Gradually, the nervous system adapts. Situations that once triggered stress feel manageable. Experiences that once felt distant begin to feel normal. The body stops bracing, and when the body stops bracing, alignment increases. Opportunities appear less chaotic. Conversations flow with less friction. Decisions feel clearer. Not because something outside suddenly favors you, but because your internal state is no longer contradicting your direction. The timeline does not arrive from elsewhere. You become compatible with it. Compatibility builds quietly through repeated steadiness, And eventually there is a tipping point, a moment when the old identity no longer has enough reinforcement to return. A moment when the new baseline feels natural rather than practiced. That is when change no longer feels like effort. It feels inevitable. There comes a moment when the old reactions no longer recognize you. They feel outdated, distant, almost irrelevant. And the new baseline feels simple, steady, normal. When that shift settles in, acceleration happens quietly. You may not detect the exact second everything changes. One day you simply notice that you are responding from a different place, and what once required effort now feels natural. That naturalness is the confirmation. Real transformation is rarely dramatic. There are no signals in the sky, no external validation announcing your arrival. Just a quiet certainty that your inner posture has changed. You interpret situations differently. You breathe without bracing. You allow without monitoring. And because interpretation shapes perception, and perception stabilizes experience, your external world begins arranging itself around that new steadiness. This is where awareness becomes crucial. When calm finally feels accessible, do not turn it into something to measure. Do not test it. Do not look for proof that it is working. The need to check is a reflex from the former identity. Stability does not require surveillance. It requires trust. Potential solidifies when observation remains steady. If doubt becomes dominant again, you reactivate the previous pattern. Not because you failed, but because you fed what was fading. Patience here is not passive waiting. It is disciplined alignment. When you sense that the old responses no longer fit, honor that shift. Protect the neutrality. Let it integrate without commentary. Live from it instead of analyzing it. As your identity remains coherent, reality reorganizes without friction. Interactions soften. Timing feels precise. Decisions feel less conflicted. Not because something outside changed its mind about you, but because you stopped sending mixed signals. The leap was never the visible outcome. The leap was the internal stabilization. Once your emotional default aligns with your desired direction, solidification becomes inevitable. The field reflects who you are being now, not who you used to be. You are not chasing the future. You are allowing the version of reality that matches your stabilized self to take form. And if you truly understand this, then you understand something powerful. You were never trapped. You were coherent with an old identity. The moment you become coherent with something greater, something calmer, something more expanded, reality has no option but to mirror it, not because you forced it, but because you finally became it.